Stop. Don't sell that. A pawn shop on Agricola Street, the paint peeling above the door, rain hammering the tin awning like it had something to prove. An old man set a small velvet box on the glass counter, hands shaking so hard the lid rattled. Inside, a star of military velour, the ribbon frayed at the edge from being folded and unfolded too many times. $40, the man behind the counter said. That's all I can do for it. The old man's throat worked. Deal, he said. No deal. Emmett Cross had been standing by the door 2 minutes waiting on nothing in particular, and now he wasn't waiting anymore. He crossed the shop floor in 4 strides, work boots leaving wet prints on the tile, and put his hand flat on the counter beside the metal. Give him back the box, Doiron. Marlene Doiron looked up from behind the register, half amused, half annoyed. He wants the money, Cross. Not your permission, sir, Emmett said. Not looking at Doiron anymore, only at the old man. I saw the crest on the ribbon. That doesn't leave this shop today, son. The old man's voice cracked around the word like it hadn't been used in a while. I don't need. I know what you need, sir. It isn't $40. The old man's eyes, pale, guarded, the eyes of somebody who had spent a lifetime reading rooms for threats, moved over Emmett Cross the way a man checks a doorway before he walks through it. Then, slowly, he closed his hand around the velvet box instead of pushing it forward. Emmett walked out of that pawn shop with $31 in his pocket where there used to be 70, and no idea, not the faintest idea, that the moment those 2 men crossed paths in the rain on Agricola Street was the last ordinary morning either of them would have for a long, long while. But to understand why a 29-year-old tow truck mechanic gave away money he didn't have for a stranger he'd never met. You have to go back 6 hours to a 1.5-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Gottingen Street, where the same rain was falling on a different roof. 5:40 a.m. Halifax, Nova Scotia. The alarm on Emmett Cross's phone buzzed once against a chipped nightstand, and his hand found it in the dark before the second buzz. Military habit, except Emmett had never been military. His father had, briefly, before the accident that took him off the base and eventually out of Emmett's life altogether. The precision was something else. The precision was Beatrice Cross, his grandmother, who had raised him to believe that a man who couldn't get out of bed on the first try couldn't be trusted with anything harder. He sat up on a mattress with a frame that creaked in 3 places, in a room so tidy it looked almost staged. Work boots by the door, a set of coveralls hung pressed on a hook, and on the shelf above the dresser a single photograph in a dollar store frame. His mother, Adaora Cross in her hospital scrubs. Laughing at something off camera. She'd died when Emmett was 10. Not in some dramatic way. An aneurysm on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of death that leaves no story, just an absence shaped exactly like a person. Next to the photograph, folded into a triangle, a Canadian flag that had covered his uncle's casket 11 years back. Emmett didn't like to think too hard about that one. He stood, and his knee popped the way it always did. An old injury from working underneath cars that were never quite up on the lift properly because the shop couldn't afford a second one. 29 years old with the joints of a man 40 years further along. Down the hall, his grandmother's door was cracked open, her breathing steady behind it. Beatrice Cross, 68, on a fixed pension that stretched about as far as Halifax rent let it, which was not very far at all. Her insulin sat on the nightstand next to a stack of bills that Emmett had stopped opening in order, because the order didn't matter. Rent. Her prescription top-up. The truck payment on the Ranger that got him to and from the garage, 6 days overdue. He picked up his banking app out of habit, the way people who don't have money check the number anyway, as if checking it enough times might change the outcome. $211. He'd checked it the night before. It had not, in fact, changed. In the kitchen there was 1 box of cereal, and he left it for his grandmother, poured black coffee into a dented thermos instead, and walked out into a rain that hadn't let up since Sunday. 7 a.m. Sutherland's garage on the Dartmouth side, across the harbor. Emmett was always first in. He was by a wide margin the best mechanic on the floor, and by an equally wide margin the lowest paid, a fact that never seemed to occur to the owner and that Emmett had stopped bringing up. By 9, a woman had pulled in with a stalling minivan and 2 kids buckled in the back, and an apology already halfway out of her mouth before she'd even parked. I know it's probably expensive, I just can't right now. Emmett had the hood up before she finished the sentence. Fuel line, ma'am. Give me 15 minutes. When she reached for her wallet after, he waved her off. It's a $9 part. Go on and get those kids to school. His co-worker, a broad-shouldered man named Roy. No, not Roy, that name meant nothing here. Call him what he was, a man named Dwayne Pritchett who'd worked the lift beside Emmett for 6 years, leaned against the tool chest and shook his head. Cross, you keep doing that, you're gonna die broke. Already broke, Emmett said, not looking up from the engine. Might as well be broke and useful. At lunch, he sat in the Ranger with the windows cracked, rain ticking on the roof, and pulled a legal pad out of the glove box, the same legal pad he'd been filling for going on 4 years. Floor plans. A building on Gottingen with the windows boarded that nobody wanted, sketched out room by room. A tutoring space, a shop classroom with 2 lift bays, donated in his imagination only. A kitchen where kids from the neighborhood could learn something other than how to disappear. At the top of one page in his mother's handwriting, copied so many times the pencil had worn a groove into the paper. If you can only feed one, feed one. He looked at it the way he looked at it every day. Like a door he knew the shape of but didn't have the key to, then closed the pad and went back to work. In under 3 hours, he'd be standing in a pawn shop with $31 in his pocket, where there used to be 70, and none of it would make sense to him yet now. The old man at the counter. You saw him with his hands shaking, sliding a metal across the glass for grocery money, and maybe you thought, sad story, next. But that metal wasn't nothing, and the man wearing that threadbare coat wasn't nothing either. To understand why he was prepared to sell it, you need his morning, too. 6:15 a.m. A rented room above a hardware store on Cunard Street, 3 kilometers from the garage as the crow flies, though the 2 men's lives had been running parallel and invisible to each other for months. Solomon Atta woke on a military cot with no alarm, because he hadn't owned a phone in almost a year. The room held a cot, a duffel bag, 1 folding chair, and a bulb on a pull string that swung slightly whenever a truck passed on the street below. It was the kind of room where silence isn't peace, it's weight. On the single shelf sat a shoebox, and that shoebox was the last thing on earth that belonged to Solomon Atta in any way that mattered. He opened it slowly, the way a man opens something he isn't ready to see. Inside, the star of military velour, a sacrifice medal beneath it, a photograph of a woman with a wide, unguarded smile and gray threading through close-cropped curls. Josephine, his wife of 34 years, and beneath the photograph, a laminated identification badge, 10 years out of date, showing a man in a tailored charcoal suit with a gaze that didn't waver for the camera. The text beneath read, Solomon O. Atta, co-founder and chairman, Crest Home Security Group. He didn't look at the badge. He never looked at the badge. He closed the lid. Solomon hadn't eaten in 2 days. Hunger, past a certain point, stops asking and just goes quiet, the way a smoke detector eventually stops beeping once the battery's fully dead. He sat on the edge of the cot with Josephine's photograph in both hands. I'm out of moves, Joe, he said to no one. I'm sorry. Josephine Atta had been diagnosed 22 months earlier. Pancreatic, stage 4, the kind of diagnosis where the oncologist stops using the word fight and starts using the word comfort. Solomon did not accept comfort. He accepted war. He spent everything he had personally, flew in specialists from Boston and Toronto, paid for a private room with a window facing a garden because Josephine had always kept one, right up until the end. But here is the thing you need to understand about Solomon Atta. He never once touched Crest Home's money to do it. Not a cent. The company employed close to 2,800 people across 4 provinces and 2 countries, and every one of those families depended on a well he refused to drain to save his own house. That was the part of him that never fully came home from the forces. Mission first, always, even when the mission was his own grief. Josephine died on a Sunday morning, her hand in his, and something in Solomon went with her. Within 2 weeks, he'd signed a power of attorney handing full operational control of a $410 million company to Graham Sutcliffe, his co-founder and oldest friend, and then he disappeared. No phone, no forwarding address. He pulled what cash remained in a personal account and walked into Halifax the way a man walks into fog, because that is what soldiers like Solomon Atta do when they decide they don't want to be found. They simply aren't. Graham searched, hired people to search. For the better part of a year, nothing came back. Solomon didn't want saving. He wanted to be invisible, but hunger doesn't much care what a man wants. 10:20 a.m. Solomon stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror and barely recognized the man looking back. Nearly 30 pounds lighter than the figure in that laminated badge, cheekbones sharp enough to draw blood, a faded olive field coat with a shoulder patch worn down to almost nothing. Almost nothing, but if you looked close, you'd see it. A crest, the letters Crestholm curling faint beneath the fabric wear. He zipped the coat, pocketed the Star of Military Valor, left the sacrifice medal in the box, and walked 4 blocks through the rain to a pawn shop with a Christmas light still taped crooked in the window in July. Every step was a negotiation between pride and survival. Pride said turn around. Survival said keep walking. Survival, as it does most days, won. The bell over the door chimed. The shop smelled of dust and machine oil, and that's when a voice came from near the back. A young man, tall, broad through the shoulders, work boots stained black at the toe, a small trade guild ring on his right hand. Emmett Cross had walked in 2 minutes earlier to pawn his late mother's wristwatch, the only thing of hers he had left worth anything, because Beatrice's insulin was due in 4 days, and $31 wasn't going to stretch that far. Instead, he handed a stranger's medal back to him and walked out with nothing at all. What happened next? In the parking lot, in the rain, between 2 men who had every reason in the world to just walk away from each other, that's where this story actually begins. 11:05 a.m. Emmett climbed into the Ranger, rain sheeting sideways off the windshield, and sat there a moment with his forehead nearly against the wheel. You just gave away the last of it, Cross, for a man you don't even know. He almost laughed because it was foolish, and it was exactly the sort of foolish his mother would have done without a second thought. Then he looked up. Solomon Atta was standing at the edge of the lot with no umbrella and nowhere obvious to go, the medal in one closed fist, rain running off his chin, staring down the street like he'd forgotten which direction led home. Emmett watched 5 seconds. 10. Don't cross. You already did enough today. He opened the truck door anyway. Sir, hey, sir, Solomon turned, those pale eyes again cataloging him, the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years reading threat in a room before reading anything else. Where are you headed? A vague gesture down the block, a lie about distance Emmett clocked immediately from the way the old man's legs were trembling under him. Get in the truck, Emmett said. That's not a request. A long beat. Solomon's jaw worked like he was chewing his own pride down to something swallowable. He got in. They rode 2 minutes in silence, wipers ticking, before Emmett noticed the posture. Spine straight, even soaking wet. Shoulders squared, the man sitting parade rest in a bench seat that smelled like motor oil, eyes flicking to the side mirror every few seconds without seeming to try. Not paranoid, trained. When a car behind them leaned on its horn at a red light, Solomon's hand shot to the door handle, knuckles white, and released a half-second later like it had never happened. Emmett's nothing. He'd grown up around men who came home from somewhere and never quite left it behind, his own father briefly before he vanished from the picture entirely. When'd you get out? He asked. Easy, like it was nothing to find out, Solomon said to the windshield. Fair enough. More silence and then unprompted, 30 years, 4 tours that had names and one that officially never happened. Emmett nodded once. Never served myself. My father did before I really knew him. I do trade work. Diesel, mostly. Something close to a smile crossed Solomon's face, the kind that never makes it onto a service photo. Copy that, he said. Not okay, not sure. Cop-ca? Emmett filed the word away without knowing quite why it mattered, only that it belonged to a man who was clearly more than the coat he was wearing. Emmett pulled into the lot of a Sobeys on Gottingen. Wait here. What are you? Just wait. Inside, he had no money left, but he had a face the store's front-end supervisor, a woman named Colette Fournier, had known since he was maybe 12 years old, hanging around after school while his mother finished a shift. He explained it in under 15 seconds and asked if he could settle up Friday. Colette looked at him a long moment. Cross, she said, you've been settling up your whole life. Go on. He came back with bread, eggs, a tin of soup, bananas, a carton of milk. Nothing fancy, enough to keep a man upright for a week and set the bags in Solomon's lap. Why? Solomon asked quietly. Why are you doing this? Because somebody did it for me once, Emmett said, pulling back onto the road. I was 11. My grandmother couldn't cover the power bill that month. A stranger paid it, and we never found out who. I figure I'll keep passing that forward till the math evens out. Solomon didn't answer for a long time. When they reached a rundown 2-story above a hardware store on Cunard, he sat still a moment, then reached inside his coat, not but for a small brass coin, old, worn smooth at the edges, an eagle and shield on one face. On the reverse, an inscription, No soldier walks alone, S.A. He pressed it into Emmett's palm. Hang on to that, son. You earned it today. Emmett turned it over, squinting at the tiny letters ringing the Crestol Masakidi Group, and understood nothing of what that meant yet. Thank you, sir. Solomon nodded once, climbed out, and disappeared into the building without a backward glance. Emmett drove home that evening, believing he'd simply helped an old veteran get through a rough week. That's all he thought it was. He had no idea what he'd actually set in motion. 6:40 p.m. Beatrice Cross stood at the stove in her house slippers, stirring rice, and didn't turn around when Emmett came through the door, smelling of rain and diesel. "You're late," she said. "Stayed a bit longer at the shop." Her eyes went to the counter. One thin bag where 9 items should have been. Beatrice Cross missed nothing. 68 years old, bad knees, a mind like a blade honed on decades of stretching too little too far. "Emmett James Cross," she said. "Full name. Never a good sign." "Yes, ma'am. Where's the rest of my list?" Silence. "You gave the money away, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. It was a verdict already handed down. He sat at the table. There was an old man, grandma, at the pawn shop, trying to sell his metal for grocery money. "I couldn't just." "I know you couldn't." She shook her head, not angry, something closer to recognition, like she was looking through him at somebody else entirely. "You're just like your mother." That woman would give away her last coat in a February squall and walk home whistling. He set the coin on the table. Beatrice picked it up, turned it slowly under the kitchen light, squinting without her reading glasses at the crest. "A man who carries something like this has a story behind him, baby. You probably gave that man more than groceries today." That night, Emmett set the coin on the shelf beside his mother's photograph and the folded flag. 3 objects now. A mother's memory, a nation's grief, a stranger's coin, and had no way of knowing the third one would turn out to weigh more than the other 2 combined. 2 mornings later, a plain white envelope was waiting under the shop's front door, no stamp, 2 words on the front in handwriting so exact it looked engraved, "The Mechanic." Inside, $200 in crisp 20s and a note, "For the groceries and the ride." You didn't have to. That's why it counted. S.A. Emmett stood over it a long moment, thinking about insulin and the truck payment and how far $200 would actually go, and then folded the note into his shirt pocket and drove straight to Cunard Street after his shift. "I appreciate this, sir," he said, holding the envelope out at the door. "I truly do. But I didn't help you for money." Solomon studied him, that same long, tactical silence. "Son, I helped you because you're my brother now. We don't charge family." Something shifted behind those pale eyes, old, deep, and Emmett recognized it, though he couldn't have named it. Respect, the kind you cannot buy and can only earn. "Sit down," Solomon said. "I'll make coffee." Over the weeks that followed, Emmett started stopping by 2, sometimes 3 times a week. Groceries, leftovers, Beatrice packed in old margarine tubs, sometimes just time. They drank bad instant coffee out of chipped mugs and talked. Solomon told stories with the names filed off, missions with no locations, teammates with no last names. He talked about Josephine more than anything, the way she hummed off-key doing dishes, how she reread the same paperback every December because it reminded her of her own mother. He never once mentioned Crestholm, never mentioned money, never once hinted at what he used to be. One evening, Emmett brought the legal pad. Solomon held it close to his face, studied the floor plan of the building on Gottingen, then started asking questions that had no business coming from a man in a rented room with 1 folding chair. "What's your liability structure?" he asked. "My what?" "Insurance," Solomon said. "If a child gets hurt on that property, who's covering it?" I hadn't gotten that far. "What's your operating runway?" "First 3 years, you need 12 months of cost banked before donations stabilize." Emmett stared at him. "How do you know all that?" "I read a lot," Solomon said, and handed the pad back. He had not, in fact, read a lot. He had built a company from a 2-desk office in Dartmouth into a $400 million operation with contracts on 2 continents. Emmett didn't know that yet. There were other things he noticed and didn't understand. A black SUV tinted glass parked across from Cunard Street on a Wednesday afternoon, with the engine idling for no obvious reason. He saw it again outside the Sobeys the following Saturday. Halifax was a Navy town. Black SUVs weren't strange exactly, but Solomon noticed too, and when he did, he went quiet and pulled the blind and changed the subject without being asked. Then there was the coin. Emmett had started carrying it clipped to his keys, and one afternoon at the till, Colette Fournier spotted it while he dug for change. "That a Crestholm coin?" she asked. "A what?" "Crestholm Security." My brother-in-law does contract work for a firm out west that partners with them. That's a serious outfit, Emmett laughed. The man I got this off can't hardly afford canned soup, Colette. She shrugged. Just saying, that crest's worth more than it looks. He pocketed it and told himself it was impossible. A broke old man in a rented room over a hardware store. No way in this world. And then on a Tuesday evening, everything Emmett thought he knew about Solomon Atta came apart. 6:20 p.m. He climbed the stairs on Cunard with a brown paper bag. Beatrice's leftover stew. Cornbread wrapped in foil. Knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Nothing. The door gave when he tried the handle. Inside, Solomon was on the floor, not unconscious but close, back against the wall, breathing shallow, skin the color of old paper. Emmett dropped the bag and crossed the room in 3 strides. Sir! Hey, look at me! Solomon's eyes drifted open, unfocused, then found Emmett's face. When's the last time you ate, son? He managed, though the question was really for himself. That silence was the answer. Emmett's training as a first aider on the shop floor kicked in without thinking. Pulse, steady but faint. No visible injury. This wasn't a fall. This was a body shutting itself down because the man attached to it had stopped taking care of it. He got a bottle of water to Solomon's lips, small sips, slow. I'm calling an ambulance, he said, reaching for his phone. Solomon's hand shot out and gripped his wrist, weak, but the fear behind it wasn't. No hospitals, he said. They'll find me. Who'll find you, sir? Solomon said nothing, eyes drifting to the window to the street below, and Emmett saw something on the old man's face he hadn't seen before. Fear, not the kind that comes from taking fire. This was the fear of a man running from something he'd chosen to leave behind and couldn't face turning back toward. Emmett didn't push. He called Pastor Nathaniel Brooks from Beulah Chapel instead, and together over the next hour they got Solomon into bed, spooned stew into him slowly, coaxed water past his lips until his breathing steadied and color crept back into his face. By 9 he was asleep. Emmett sat in the folding chair, watching, and thought, who is chasing you, old man? He hadn't meant to look, that much was true. But he needed an emergency contact, an ID, something, in case there wasn't a next time to be there for. He opened the duffel first, a razor, spare clothes, nothing useful. Then the shoebox. He'd seen it before, the medals, Josephine's photograph, but this time his fingers went deeper, past the metal, and found paper. A folded legal document, dense with clauses and 2 signatures. He read it under the swinging bulb, slowly at first, then not slowly at all. Power of attorney. Transfer of operational authority. Grantor, Solomon O. Atta, co-founder and chairman emeritus, Crestholme Security Group, grantee. Graham R. Sutcliffe, Chief Executive Officer. He read it a second time, a third. His hands went completely still. He set the document down, pulled out his phone, typed 2 words into the browser. Crestholme Security. The results loaded in under 3 seconds. Crestholme Security Group, government and private contracts across 4 provinces and 2 nations. 2,800 employees. Estimated annual revenue north of $400 million. He scrolled to a page titled Our Story and found a photograph from 9 years back. 2 men shaking hands at a ceremony in Ottawa, both in tailored suits, both smiling for the camera. The caption read, Co-founders Solomon Atta and Graham Sutcliffe mark Crestholme's 400th government contract. The man on the right, younger, heavier, healthier, but unmistakably him, was asleep 4 feet away on a cot in a room with 1 bulb and no phone. Emmett sat with that for a long while, the shoebox open on his knees, the rain starting up again outside, and understood, in the way a person understands very few things all at once, that he had not been helping a broke old veteran get through a rough week. He'd been the only person in the world Solomon Atta had let close enough to see him fall apart, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with that. He put the document back exactly as he'd found it. He didn't say anything the next morning, or the morning after that. He kept bringing groceries. He kept bringing stew. But now he watched differently. The questions about liability structures, the flicker toward the window at every passing car, the word copy instead of okay. And every piece slid into a shape that finally made sense. It was Beatrice, 3 weeks later, who forced the question. She'd taken to asking after the old man the way she asked after any of Emmett's people, and one evening, ladling out rice, she said, Offhand, you ever look up that Crestholme thing properly, baby? Emmett set his fork down. You knew? I'm old, not blind. Man carries a coin like that, keeps his back straight in a room with 1 chair, asks you about liability insurance for a youth center. Emmett James Cross, I've read The Man Before You Did. Why didn't you say anything? Because it wasn't mine to say. She looked at him hard. It's not really yours either. Not till he's ready. So Emmett waited. He kept showing up, and 2 months in, on an evening when the rain had finally let up for the first time in what felt like a season, Solomon set 2 mugs of coffee down and said, "Without any lead-up at all, you found the papers." That night, Emmett didn't lie. "Yes, sir." Solomon nodded slowly, looking at his hands. "Josephine used to say I'd rather die honest in a bad room than live comfortable in a lie." He let out something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Guess I finally get to test that theory." He told him the rest of it that night. Crestholm from a 2-desk office in Dartmouth, the 2,800 families depending on it. The war he'd waged against a cancer that didn't care how many contracts he'd won, the fortune he refused to touch to save his own house because it was never only his house to spend. He told him about signing everything over to Graham Sutcliffe and walking into the fog on purpose, because being found meant being seen, and being seen meant people expecting him to be the man in that laminated badge again. And he did not know, some days, if that man still existed anywhere inside him. Emmett listened without interrupting, the way his mother used to say a real man listens, with his whole chest, not just his ears. "You're not hiding from Sutcliffe, are you?" Emmett said finally. "You're hiding from having to be somebody again." Solomon looked up at him a long moment, something breaking loose behind his eyes. "Copy that, Marine," he said, and this time it came out closer to a laugh than either of them expected. The black SUV, it turned out, belonged to a private investigator Graham Sutcliffe had kept on retainer the entire time, quietly circling, under strict instructions never to approach, only to confirm that Solomon Atta was still alive and breathing somewhere in Halifax. When Solomon finally called the number he'd memorized and never dialed, Graham didn't yell, didn't demand explanations. He just said very quietly, "Took you long enough, old man." And Emmett, watching from the folding chair, saw 30 years of friendship survive a year of silence in under 4 words. What came after moved fast, the way things do once a person stops running from themselves. Solomon didn't take the company back. Graham had earned it fair, he said, and a man his age had no business chasing 4 provinces of contracts again. But he did something else. He walked into the boarded-up building on Gottingen Street with Emmett and a structural engineer he called personally. And by the following spring, there was a sign above a freshly painted door that read Cross Community Trade Center, tutoring rooms, a real shop floor with 2 working lifts, a kitchen where kids from the neighborhood learned to cook something other than instant noodles, standing over a hot plate alone. Solomon funded the first 3 years operating runway out of his own pocket, the same money he'd once refused to touch even to save Josephine. Because, he told Emmett, some money only means something once you've got someone worth spending it on again. Emmett kept the coin on his keychain. He kept the shelf, too, though it had 4 objects on it now instead of 3. His mother's photograph, the folded flag, Solomon's coin, and delivered one evening by courier with no return address, a small cedar box holding the Star of Military Velour itself. Redeemed quietly from Marlene Doiron's shop and never once mentioned again by either man. The note tucked beneath it, in that same precise handwriting, read, "Some things aren't meant to be sold. They're meant to be passed down. This belongs to you now. Not because you ever wore a uniform, but because you fought for a stranger in the rain and didn't ask what was in it for you. That's its own kind of courage." Solomon Atta, 61 years old, no longer disappearing into anybody's fog, sat most evenings now by a window 2 blocks from a trade center that hadn't existed a year earlier, drinking coffee that had finally gotten better. And for the first time since a Sunday morning 18 months before, he did not want to vanish. He wanted very plainly to stay. And Emmett Cross, 3 months after the ribbon cutting, on an ordinary Tuesday with the same gray rain falling that had been falling, the day he met a stranger in a pawn shop, stopped at a Sobeys for milk his grandmother needed for a cobbler, and found himself in line behind a young woman in hospital scrubs. A baby balanced on one hip, a toddler gripping her coat, counting coins out on the belt slowly, carefully, the way people count when they already know it won't be enough, but they finish the ritual anyway. Formula, diapers, a small jar of baby food she was quietly sliding back toward the cashier. Emmett Cross stepped forward without a second's hesitation. "Ring hers up with mine," he said. She turned, startled, eyes already wet. "You don't have to, sir. Somebody told me once," he said, "brotherhood or sisterhood, whichever you like, doesn't come with an expiry date." She couldn't get a word out past the thank you, and Emmett carried her bags to the car before going back for his milk, and Colette Fournier, ringing him through at last, said nothing at all. Just shook her head and smiled the way people do when they've watched the same kindness make its way around a full circle and land exactly where it started.